So now, like, let's move like a layer down now. So now we have some products in market, our service in market, our website's live, we're doing commerce, we're booking hotel bookings, whatever it may be. Your own customer data better be part of the data you're using. And I don't mean just, are you dropping pixels and remarketing customers? Okay, fine. Yes, you should be doing things like that. But I mean, are you doing actual analysis on your customer file? Are you identifying, are you doing segmentation? Are you identifying who tends to be price sensitive, who's not price sensitive, who, repeat purchasers, high frequency purchasers, any kind of RFM analysis that will be useful to you. Are there some customers who always buy full price, right? Don't send them. They don't like, you're going to incentivize loyalty in other ways than sending them promotions, because they are reflecting in their own behavior that they don't, their behavior is not driven by promotions, right? There's a whole bunch of different analysis that you would be wanting to do to your customer file, and also you should be trending these things, right? Like, so you should know things like old school catalog marketers would do, right? Like, they understood, like, if you get a first time customer to make a repeat purchase in the first 30 days after
get ready to
them,
deep dive
like,
into the world of digital transformation, where we explore the latest trends, innovations, and challenges shaking up industries. Join us as we decode the secrets behind successful digital strategies and hear from experts who are at the forefront of disrupting the status quo. In each episode, we'll unravel the mysteries of the digital realm and uncover the hidden opportunities that lie within. From artificial intelligence to blockchain, from automation to cybersecurity, we'll leave no digital stone unturned. But hold on tight, because this podcast isn't your average tech talk. We're injecting a hefty dose of wit and humor into every episode, making learning about digital transformation an absolute blast. So if you're ready to embrace the digital revolution with a smile on your face, tune in to the Digital Disruption Podcast and get ready to be entertained, informed, and inspired. Don't miss out on the fun. Subscribe now and join us on this wild digital journey.
Off to the races we go. Hey, Sean. Hey, Patrick.
Hey, Daoud, how you doing, man?
Good morning to you. How's everything?
It's good. It's good, man.
It's a dog eat dog world, and I've got milk-bone clothing on.
And you're in Alaska, right? Is that correct? That's the rumor, anyway.
Yes, that was a Cheers reference, by the way. If anybody likes a good Norm joke, yes, I am Alaska. So I should have done a Northern Exposure joke. That would have been hard. But yes, I am calling from Alaska, where it is 7:30 a.m. and I'm pretty sure the sun is still not up. So we're thriving up here in the Great North, the 49th state. Fun fact. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have 30 minutes. I'm going to keep you guys disciplined because you always go beyond time. So you have 30 minutes for today. What do you have cooking for us?
Well, I was actually listening to a podcast, and totally unrelated to what we do here, but it was actually a hunting podcast, and it was Randy Newberg, who I've probably mentioned before. I'm a huge fan. He's a huge advocate for public land access in the United States for hunters and recreationists. Love Randy Newberg. But what he was actually talking about was in terms of wildlife conservation in the U.S., like, do we go with like short-term, what hunters want, high ratios of big bucks with big antlers and all these things, or do we use like the best of conservation science to make wildlife conservation decisions that are best for the long-term health of the wildlife as a resource? And this was in the context of chronic wasting disease and a number of different issues, but it prompted in my brain this thought, well, in the industries that we serve and in the digital world in general, digital marketing, analytics, etc., e-commerce, what do digitally mature organizations do to ensure that they are actually using data, as best as possible, as expertly as possible, and how do they maintain the discipline and the courage to make data-driven decisions? So that's what I thought we'd talk about today. And we can explore some examples of who's doing it well, where some recent failures are, but more so we want to focus on sort of the practice of it and how you can ensure that you, are a mature person about using data.
Patrick, I'm gonna throw a pun in here because you said
Sure.
big bucks, and I think this is a great segue into this. But I think most of the organizations that are listening are driven by the idea of we need big bucks in the greenback sense. So how do you? I'm gonna start this off right now. How do you go about making a decision that may have financial implication? Right. So a lot of the data that we look at, we're always looking at how can we be more profitable or how can we increase revenue, right? 9 times out of 10. Very rarely is it something in the other realm. What are we looking at? What should we be looking at when going about that? Because I feel like a lot of people might see an immediate impact or look for a short term versus maybe a long term. And I think this kind of ties back to what you were saying with long-term conservation versus maybe short wins.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, one, just bringing up the whole big bucks pun, right? Is like, okay, do you want big bucks in terms of revenue growth? Do you want big bucks in terms of profitability? How do you want to balance the two, right? Again, are you willing to take customer acquisition growth short term, realizing that long term that translates into revenue and profit? There's a number of ways you can consider that, but all would require the data to support your decision making. So I guess maybe where I would start with that is the potential data sources that we could be using to make data-driven decisions, the contexts in which those different data sources will be more or less appropriate, right? And then we can kind of talk through that. But I think it's a great point, is like, how would you get to making decisions around that? I mean, one, like market research, right? A lot of people don't really think of that as data for data-driven decision making, but boy, if you're in the go-to-market phase, market research should be the first part, right? Like if you don't know what your total addressable market is, if you don't know, if you haven't at least taken a scientific wild-ass guess at what your sort of ideal customer profile might look like, what are the audiences you're trying to sell to then start narrowing down, right? Like, because if you do no exercise of this kind at the start, you really don't have a good idea of what the opportunity for a product or service is. You better have some idea. If it's direct to consumer, it's like if you have a product with a really high price point, it's a considered purchase. It's not really a necessity. You better start pushing your household income estimates up, right? Or certain age groups where maybe the income isn't that much, but they have a lot more discretionary spending capacity because they don't have as many responsibilities as older folks with families. So there's a whole bunch of considerations. So market research, right? Better do some market research if you're.
Well, and this is very like to even simplify this further. Like you're taking a page out of like Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, right? Like again with the end in mind, which that's one that's stuck with me like for a long time, and I think a lot of people love to reference it, but maybe don't think about that. Like, what is the end goal? And so when you start to look at TAM's a great example, right? Like in a previous lifetime, I worked with a few pretty large groups, and you'd be surprised at if you don't think about those things early on, or you get in a habit where maybe you've been able to control market, but then products start to enter the market that compete. How often are you auditing your market share, or like what is again within that total addressable market? And I say this because someone will say, well, we want to grow in revenue 20%. That's a great goal. How much of the market do you own already? How much is available? We used to do this with HVAC companies quite a bit. And so I think everybody can relate to this. You've had a broken furnace or, a broken air conditioner. Some of the best in any of the data I've seen, some of the best market share that I've seen, it's roughly like 30%. If you can get to 30% total addressable market, you're not monopolized, but you are absolutely controlling
Oh
that
yeah.
market.
Yeah. It's a huge consideration, and you should have some idea of that
Yeah.
when you kick off an enterprise. And I think you also bring up an additional concern there, which would be, and it's a related type of data, but competitor data. You may not have. They're not. You're obviously nobody's going to share their like 0 and 1P data with you. But on the other hand, like you can meticulously study their web product, their app. You
What's their price
can,
points? What you start backing
yeah,
into some of this, you could.
yes,
Are you going to be 100% accurate? No, but if you get a pretty good approximation, is it doing this research, looking at, okay, what's their price point? What are they willing to offer? And you can start to build out, especially in your space. If you feel like you really know your space, you should be able to pretty much replicate what you think your competitor's offering, and to build out kind of like what their market share might be. And there's some indicators for getting
oh yeah,
more technical, like on the search front. Google Trends is really helpful for this, and then backing into some keyword data. And you
yeah,
can kind of build out some models that give you an idea of at least demand in your market,
yeah.
and then where your top competitors sit versus you.
Yeah, and
Um,
if it's a space with a lot of public companies, like Hoover's Dun Bradstreet data, it's worth paying for some of that data for sure. Um,
And there's
well, let's
groups that
say so.
specialize in that too, right?
Oh
Like
yeah,
you can go,
absolutely.
yeah, you can go buy that data or have someone do that, and it's worth it. Actually, I've known a few groups that have hesitated to do it, but for the cost versus the data you get back, and I think depending on the industry, they're like on 2-year cycles with some of those groups. It's
Yep,
really worth it if you really want to dive into what's going on in your industry. It's a worthy investment.
absolutely. So now, like, let's move like a layer down now. So now we have some products in market, our service in market, our website's live. We're doing commerce. We're booking hotel bookings, whatever it may be. Your own customer data better be part of the data you're using. And I don't mean just are you dropping pixels and remarketing customers? Okay, fine. Yes, you should be doing things like that. But I mean, are you doing actual analysis on your customer file? Are you identifying, are you doing segmentation? Are you identifying who tends to be price sensitive, who's not price sensitive, who, repeat purchasers, high frequency purchasers, any kind of RFM analysis that will be useful to you. Are there some customers who always buy full price, right? Don't send them. They don't like, you're going to incentivize loyalty in other ways than sending them promotions, because they are reflecting in their own behavior that they don't their behavior is not driven by promotions, right? uh, there's a whole bunch of different analysis that you would be wanting to do to your customer file, and also you should be trending these things, right? Like, so you should know things like old school catalog marketers would do, right? Like, they understood, like, if you get a first time customer to make a repeat purchase in the first 30 days after acquiring them, like, that person, it tends to be X% stickier than a single purchase, right? That somebody that doesn't purchase in those first 30 days. And so that you're trying to incentivize, get people to raise their hand earlier in their customer life cycle to tell you what kind of a customer they are or are going to be, right? So customer file analysis, really important.
This makes
Yeah,
me
sorry, go
think of.
ahead.
I was going to say, this makes me think of like the prime example of, no pun intended. Again, I'm full of puns today, apparently. But Amazon, right? Like,
Yeah,
how many times have we walked into a room in our own experiences and someone says, "I want to be the Amazon of X,"
right.
and the secret sauce to Amazon is they've built possibly the best first party data profile
Yeah,
um, possible. And they've done that over years and years, and they took
yeah,
losses to do it.
yeah,
It didn't happen overnight, but they like that is if you're talking about being a data driven decision or a decision making organization, like they're
yeah,
probably one of the best examples in market. And it
yeah, I
comes
would
from
agree.
not only like I'm understanding user buying behaviors, right? Like I'm making it easier for you to purchase things, which again, not everybody
Yeah.
can replicate that. So don't get attached to maybe the convenience factor. That's really what
Hmm.
Amazon sells. But they're taking that data and then they're constantly testing. And
Yeah,
so it's one thing
yeah,
to be a data driven organization and say like our data is showing us X. They're also
yeah,
willing to then go and test behavior and test some of those hypotheses, multiple tests at a time concurrently. Like they are, if you saw how big their testing group was, within each of their kind of silos, you'd be amazed. And they're running 15, 20 tests at a time, and you would never know that they're running them as a consumer, but they're constantly looking to optimize. And so I think that's something that's really important here when we talk about being able to use the data to make a decision, but then acting on it or knowing, okay, well, is there another lever we can pull to maybe push this a little bit more? And it could be as simple as conversion rate optimization. It could be as complicated as, for Amazon logistics. Like, how close do we need to be to someone to get them the Prime next day experience?
Yeah. But I think that brings up a good point. Yeah, no, that brings up a good point. There, I mean, I've referred to this article before, and I will again probably. But Eugene Wei, his article. Let me get the title just to make sure I don't butcher it. But yeah, just called "Invisible Asymptotes," and he was a financial analyst at Amazon, and he's written about this pretty extensively. And like when they launched their Prime product, which was like a huge hockey stick growth driver for them, right? Like they didn't just go to market with something, right, and just say, "Oh, this will be disruptive." They actually worked with not just with their product people. Like, is this going to be something that appeals to consumers? Okay, yes, it has to do that, but they also work closely with their financial analysts to say, like, does this drive growth in a way that's sustainable and profitable? Which kind of goes back to the original conversation, which is, how do you drive increased customer stickiness? How do you drive increased frequency of purchase? And ultimately, how do you try to translate that into increased profits, right? So you have to not only have consumer data, behavioral data, kind of market research data, competitor data, but you also have to say, does this decision, as disruptive as it might be, does it make sense financially for us, right? So and Amazon's actually another great example of like talking about maybe next day shipping or the Prime experience. What's the appetite of the consumer, right? So they come with a hypothesis to say, he says, is this feasible? Here's the infrastructure that probably has to exist for us to execute this at a scale of, over 300 million customers, let's just say there, right, in North America. Well, there were brands already trying to do this a little bit, right? Zappos. And it was either next day shipping or 2-day guaranteed. And so then the satisfaction piece comes, well, could we do it in 24 hours? Could we do next day delivery? And so I think this goes back to other considerations, right? Like if you compare Zappos to Amazon, right? It's like, you're talking about a very like a niche e-commerce player versus a site where you can literally buy anything, including a motorcycle, right? Like, or an electric car or something, right? Like, I mean, like you literally can buy a motorcycle from China in a crate on Amazon if you want to, right? Like it's,
I get mine from AliExpress, but I have
to, I
there's all that's valid in thinking about, like, again, what data is available, and then having the diligence, like you said, maybe having the having the wherewithal to like actually pressure test this and go through it to say, like, is this something that's going to produce lift? And you mentioned profitability. That study shows they weren't very profitable on it for many years, right?
Yeah, it took a while. Well, as a company, they weren't profitable for many years, but actually releasing Prime was a big driver of that kind of hockey stick where the scale of growth, I would say it was one of the reasons they were able to become profitable, actually, because it did just increase their growth trajectory so much. And the kind of stickiness factor and frequency of purchase factor. So, yeah.
Well, and I bring that up just because, again, depending on who our audience is today, who's tuning in, listening, profit versus revenue, right? And a lot of groups are pressured, like going into some of the revenue-based stuff. We've seen a lot of groups push for revenue, not being profitable. And at some point that dries up. WeWork's a great example, right?
Yeah,
they looked at their market.
Absolutely. Yeah,
like WeWork's fantastic as an example. Many would say the folly was they didn't own the real estate that they had created, right? They were leasing spaces and then leasing again.
Yeah.
The model itself was pretty good. And if they had owned those properties or owned that real estate, we might be talking about them in a different light, hindsight being 2020. But I mentioned that because it's revenue versus profitability.
Yeah.
Also knowing, okay, well, what are we tweaking or what are we trying to get? And
well, we have clients in the e-commerce space, various kinds of. I don't want to mention any names in case they consider it proprietary, in their industry. But like, and we're not like letting any cat out of the bag here anyway, because Google's pushing this heavily and has been for years. But the idea of value-based bidding around profit versus revenue, right? Like, so if you can find a way to collect data, even if it's an estimate, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But if you have a $1,000 sale on your website, but your gross profit on that is only $80, say, for example, say you have very slim margins. Like in terms of the conversion value that you capture in your media buying platforms and in your analytics tools, you should be capturing $80 and not $1,000. Right?
From a standpoint, zero that out back into it.
Yeah, from the standpoint of what you should be optimizing your performance marketing channels around, that $80 is the amount that matters, not the 1,000, right? So there's just considerations like that, right? Make sure you're collecting the right data. So we talked about financial data a little bit in the Amazon example. Economic data, man. The economic conditions you're operating in have a huge impact, especially if you're a non-commodity, like non-essential e-commerce player or retailer, omni-channel retailer. Like if you're selling products that are mostly based on consumer discretionary spending capacity, the economic conditions are going to have an impact on you, regardless of how good you are. I mean, you might be in a very narrow niche where you're like only the ultra wealthy are your customers, and they may or may not. Some ultra wealthy are very savvy and
or you're one of three players in that space, right? You're highly specialized to where you're gonna feel it a little bit, but you're probably not going to be subject to a massive decline in interest over time. Like I think of like sporting goods is an interesting one, right?
Yeah.
If you look at a lot of sports, you have to buy equipment. Nobody's going to stop playing soccer, right? You're not going to stop making soccer cleats or soccer balls. You're not going to stop.
I think, you mean football, right? Daoud's looking at you like you're talking
Sorry,
alien language, Sean.
It's a football. We throw it with our hands. Nate Bargatze this week, not to add a timestamp to this, but he's going to be on SNL, possibly one of the funniest SNL skits of the last 10 years. But I think that's a really good example, right? Like where a market, if you wanted to get as deep as golf, right? Like golf equipment, it's like a 4-year cycle typically. So people still buy. That cycle in an economic downturn may move from 4 years to maybe 6. But people are still going to buy equipment, or they might buy it on a secondary market. There was a really interesting one that I heard. Porsche years ago when they basically killed like the 920, like the non-911 series. And the new CEO comes in and he goes, basically someone's like, well, what's the price point for what's going to be your entry level Porsche? And he goes, a used Porsche is the entry level Porsche. Like we're going to get back to like building something that's a high end,
Sure.
And I say that because talking about that type of market, Porsche, someone who's buying a Porsche probably is always going to be in the market for a Porsche. So if you understand your product and what that niche actually is meant for, where those fluctuations can exist, I think you can weather some of that and make better decisions.
Yep. All right. Fantastic point. I'm going to move on to another. What you mentioned when we were discussing getting ready for the call, public data sources, right? Like if you're a company that, if you're in an industry that is impacted by the weather, by the flu season, by really any kind of publicly available, data sets. There's so much publicly available data now, but weather, disease, etc. All those are some of the big ones. But right, like if you like you can via, feeds, APIs, whatever, pull that data, and you can, I mean, in Google Ads, you can write scripts that will just like update bidding, for example. You could do this in your programmatic by, in your demand side platforms, but, and you can obviously just bring this data like into your data warehouse and you can trend it. So from an analysis standpoint, you can just kind of overlay time trended data, weather patterns, flu season by geography and all of these things, and you can overlay that with transactions, revenue, whatever, right? And then you can kind of get an idea of what is the actual correlation between these things. So again, to make data driven, right, there's a hunch. I mean, obviously you sell more ice cream when it's 105 than when it is 5 below zero, but this doesn't take a data scientist to tell you that. But if you really wanted to understand how much more market is available to you when it's 105 versus 5 below, then you might want to start doing some different analysis. Like, are you willing to, on really hot days, are you wanting to eat into the competition a bit?
Bidding up? Are you doing a value, like, hey, free, talking about ice cream, something as simple as that, right? Free scoop, or, a free extra scoop with purchase one. So 2 scoops for one. Right. Are you willing to do that? And then are you willing to activity? Yeah. Are you open for a longer window? Are you extending business hours? Are you staffed up? Like, that's really where that data can be valuable. Like HVAC's another one that's heavily seasonal.
HVAC is huge, yeah.
And value-based bidding and bidding up when it is hot, knowing, hey, we used to test this a lot. Like, if it's going to be 90 or above in a market, demand will shoot up like 2x.
Right.
And so if that's coming, you can, weather's, 10 days out typically. Right. If you can start to use that predictive piece, we're going to bid up come Thursday, Friday, Saturday, when more people are home, and shocker, weather's going to be in the 90s. We need to have availability. We need to have staff for it. We need to be able to handle that demand. But that's a really good example of using that trend data. Another one is in hospitality. I found a really good case study on Red Roof Inn, how they were doing this. They went back, this is like 10 years ago or so, and they went back and looked at basically like weather patterns around destinations. And what they've started to look at is what areas are most affected by weather to cause delays or cancellations, and can we offer value pricing or offers in those areas and in those markets. And it had a huge effect on their revenue and their bottom line. So there's different applications for it, whether it's travel, hospitality, home services, but looking at seasonality or behavioral data that you can then test and look at year over year. And you'll start to find there's a lot of consistency. Like, very rarely do you see things that are abnormal or abject.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The kind of last piece would be kind of what I would call sort of performance and behavioral data, right? Which would be, I mean, are you creating reports in Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics? Of course, anybody can create a report. Like, that's what that's sort of like, that's like saying, can you like put your groceries in a grocery bag, right? Like, creating a report is like that's just what the platform does. Fine. Okay. But do you actually use the data? Do you formulate hypotheses? Do you do digital storytelling? Are you validating that the data is saying what you think it is? Sense checking that? Are you then creating an actual reasonable interpretation of the data that would lead you to be able to answer business questions and make decisions from it, right? That requires a different level of discipline. You may need to create more advanced dashboards. You may actually need to apply some data science methods to this data, right? And similarly for your like marketing performance data, right? Just, who cares what your CPC was and who cares what your click-through rate was, other than if you look at it over time and then again translate into something like, does it make sense from a profitability standpoint? Does it make sense from a growth target standpoint? Are our channels balanced properly, right? Now you're talking about, well, let's do some statistical based approaches that include like media mix modeling, marketing mix modeling. we're going to try and be disciplined here, Daoud.
It's taking that what and like putting the why behind it, right? Like it's willing to. I had a boss who used to talk about this in the light of like pulling the thread. Like, great, we've pulled a thread. Let's keep pulling at it and see what unravels. And being willing to do that, and then showcase that, right? Like sometimes it's a roadshow. Some like lobbying for that insight, or saying like, hey, we have something here. I need more. I need a green light to keep pulling at the thread.
So here's the deal. In order to do that, you're right. You got to keep pulling on the thread, and you have to have a business question you're trying to answer. But I'm going to try and kind of wind us down, and I want your reflections on this too, Sean. But I mean, personally, I think it comes down to the organization and the leadership. And as an analyst or a researcher, you have to have the courage and the discipline to be right, and the humility to be wrong. Sometimes you have a hunch, you do a whole bunch of research, you formulate a hypothesis, and it turns out maybe your data was wrong, and you were interpreting it wrong, and you should be humble enough to say so. But you also have to have the courage to be right when you're right. And if you have a CEO or a CMO, I only say CEOs because I think psychologists have shown that they're the most likely to index high, like in the same sort of personality types as sociopaths. So I
think they're called eccentrics. It's chief eccentric. There's another way.
But if you have a CEO who, you come to them with the data, it's right, you've given a sound interpretation, this is the decisions we should make, and the CEO just says, well, I have a hunch we should be doing something different, or my intuition tells me, or my experience tells me I'm not gonna listen to you. Well, okay. Nike's a perfect example of a recent case where a CEO off the rails can, quite literally, Nike lost something like $24 billion in public, market capitalization. Interestingly, you go from a complete outsider CEO to literally their new CEO was somebody who started as an intern at Nike and worked his way up, understands the brand inside and out from top to bottom. There's a reason why that pendulum went boom to boom, right? So discipline. So if you are a marketing analyst, a data scientist in an organization, you have to have that kind of courage to be right. You have to be forceful and respectful, and also find a way to do compelling storytelling with the data. But as a leader, you have to be humble enough, if you want to stand on a soapbox and claim that you're a data-driven organization, you have to have the discipline and maturity and wisdom as a leader to allow your data to drive your decision making. And
I think you need to operate from the scientific methodology. Like, a good leader is someone saying, okay, can we test it? Going back to the Amazon example, look at food service. We could go on about this, but like it's same time, Starbucks does a switch. They hire the guy who was the CEO of Chipotle, and before that was the CEO of Taco Bell. Taco Bell is really well known for constantly testing their food product, right? And food industry is a little different, but it's a little bit easier to do that. But they have literally test kitchens, right, where they're doing this. And I say that because there are ways to go about this, not just in those industries. They're like, okay, can we test this? Great, you've brought me a case here. You think this could have big impact? Let's test it. And being open to that. And then when you reach either it works or it doesn't, both parties being able to say, yeah, it was great or it wasn't. What else can we test? Being constantly ahead of the curve, or at least accepting that you're not going to always be ahead of trend, but you can test and test into trend. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but like you said, having that courage or just maybe respect in the room. Like, I hired an expert. If I'm a CEO, I hired someone to go do this work for me. I better listen to them, or at least give them the fair shot to make a case.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, we blew our discipline. Yeah,
I was going to say, were we there?
No, we blew it by 1 minute. We're sort of immature and infantile, but I guess we tried.
In the world of football, there's extra time too, and Lionel Messi gets 5 minutes. Why can't we?
That's true. I'm sure we had some I'm sure we had some injury time in there somewhere. So, how'd we do, Daoud? What's your verdict?
I'll let it slip. I've seen nothing.
Fair official.
I think I think we can officially call this episode Digital Soapbox. We've been on our soapbox long enough today, but
all right, that's it. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Enjoy your time in Alaska, and hopefully it's cooling off in Cairo by now.
It is getting cooler now. Well, I'll see you next week then. See ya.
Right.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
You too.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the world of digital transformation and gained valuable insights to help navigate the ever-changing landscape. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us on our website, e-CENS.com, or connect with us on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and stay tuned for more exciting discussions on the forefront of digital innovation. Remember, the future is now, and it's time to embrace the power of transformation. Thanks for listening, and until next time.